Welcome to the Rick Tell the Box webcast. Today's special guest, Todd Urban of Softube. Hi everyone, this is Rick Tell and the Rick Tell Zoomcast in the box. And today's guest is Todd Urban, who is a project educator at Softube Software, amongst other things. Could you tell us what exactly is a Softube product educator?
Yeah, hey Rick. So I initially came on board with Softube somewhere around 3 years ago. I started making content for Softube, mostly marketing material. But my background is I'm a musician first, but also an educator. My passion is directly tied to education. So I teach at a 2-year college in New Jersey, right outside of New York. And part of my role with Softube was to make sure that we were providing content to our users that uh, is specifically trying to help the users use our products in a way that benefits them creatively and workflow wise, and just helps them hear sonically what the differences from product to product are, and help them figure out what application certain products would be best for.
Very good. Okay, so you're a Jersey boy.
I'm a Jersey boy. Yeah, we all claim to be from New York, but nobody actually lives in New York City. It's actually an
Oh, I
empty
did.
place.
No, I did.
Yeah.
Can't fool me.
Yeah.
I've been there for 40 years. So
Yeah.
anyway, so you play piano and it says strings.
Yeah, I play the strings inside the piano. Now that's my master's degree is actually in orchestral arranging. So I am I originally started on double bass, and I primarily focused on double bass, but I had a hand injury when I was doing my undergraduate work, switched to classical piano, and I doubled on bass and piano for many years. And then for about 10 years, I spent most of my time writing uh, orchestral arrangements, mostly for educational institutions to teach technique. And so I'm fairly competent on violin, viola, and cello too, and especially when it comes to arranging. And that's also my passion with recording too. Is I love working intimately with artists rather than getting a large session, never getting to meet the artist. And so I love working in chamber music and anything where you really can work directly with musicians.
So about 3 years ago, you started doing stuff. Now, Softube is from Sweden. Is that their?
Yes. Yeah, we like to say that Softube started out in a dorm room, whether that's the literal story or more of a folklore story. It was four gentlemen who were in Linköping, Sweden, and they decided to come up with the first uh, our first product, which was a guitar amp modeling product. And the idea was to have something that was modeled point to point, component level modeling that not only sounded like a guitar amp but felt like a guitar amp. So when you turn the input gain up, you're feeling it like you're actually plugging into a guitar amp. And that was a great product, but since then the modeling has also gone in totally different directions with things with the partnership with Universal Audio, with impedance matching with the Unison preamps, and all of our Marshall amplifiers. And so the company's really branched out into a lot of new territory.
All right. So I noticed that you do a lot with the Marshall
Mhm.
amplifiers. Um, Specifically, obviously, you're supported by Marshall, allowed to use their name and such in your products. What do you think sets apart your amp sims from all the others that are out there? What do you think about the Soft Tube that makes it different than, say, anyway, I won't mention the competitors, but nevertheless, there's quite a few.
Yeah, so there are a few things. Our big thing that we like to focus on is sound quality, meaning that it sounds as close as possible to the amp. Um, an amplifier does not exist in a dead space. Even if you're in your bedroom practicing with a real amplifier, there's some acoustical components. So the modeling of both the amp heads and the cabinets take into account what's going on acoustically in a room. We have the ability to adjust mic placement within a room. But the other side of it, well, there's two other sides of it. So when it comes down to something like modeling a head in the circuitry, it's the idea of capturing all the nonlinearities, the way all the circuitry works together. The fact that when you turn the high EQ up, that may have some ramification on what's going on with the mid EQ at the same time, that they don't necessarily work independent of each other, but there's a lot of circuitry that works together. So we capture all that. And then the third part is the fact that when you play, if you're going to play live through the amp rather than use it as a plugin after you've tracked, that there's a feeling that your instrument is plugged directly into that amp. So there is a response in terms of the way the strings feel, in terms of the way the transients are affected when you attack the string. And being able to capture all that brings us closer to plugging directly into a real amp than a lot of the products we've seen in the past.
And also, I mean, another company that mentions that type of interaction, Kemper.
Mm-hmm.
Those are very expensive, and they're hardware as opposed to software. So you would say this is similar to Kemper interaction, only in a plug-in rather than a whole $2,000 box.
Yeah, I know there's the Kemper amps. There's UA has the aux. There are other products out there that are hardware based, which are hardware and software units that work together. Um, I've honestly never done an A/B together. We have tremendous respect for the other companies that are doing similar type of modeling out there.
So, what are your favorite software plugins from the Softube?
Yeah, it's interesting. I had a question today from a user who was asking me if they wanted to go out and buy a compressor, and they said, should I look at TubeTech versus the Summit Audio versus the FET compressor?
That's the one I was
And
thinking of, the FET. The FET.
oh, okay, yeah. And the reality is, I like to tell people that you don't always need a a ton of tools. You need to know, you need to have some very good tools that you can learn really well. And yeah, there's differences between them. So my answer to them was it depends on what you're doing. For something, if you're looking for a compressor and you're looking for something that's very open and very natural, especially on a voice, I love the TLA 100A by Summit Audio. It's it's a very simple compressor to use because you're basically dialing how much gain reduction you want. You're setting, you could set a faster or slower attack and release time, but it's a little easier than some compressors that have a lot more options in terms of being able to select ratio or being able to select knee or anything like that. But then, yeah, if you compare that to something like the TubeTech compressors, the the TubeTech one is going to have a fuller sound, maybe a little bit more aggressive sound depending on the way you set it. And something like the FET compressor, the FET compressor, I tell people all the time, is one of my favorite distortions. It's a great compressor. It's a super fast compressor, but being able to set it in a way that you have that quick attack and release with the all buttons in or a very high ratio can generate a little bit of distortion. And the way it just kind of adds to something like a crunchy guitar sound really helps bring it forward in a mix. So it depends on really your ultimate goal. But the point is, it was that idea that having some tools that you really learn to explore inside and out is really what I think is the most important. Not necessarily whether you got this.
I totally agree.
Yeah.
Because you can have hundreds of plugins and literally not know how to use them.
Right. Right.
I mean, now in my case, I started recording in the '70s, pretty much late '60s and '70s, as a musician in the beginning, and then eventually I went to the studio world in the later '70s, and and so what I really like is when I see stuff emulated that I used to use in the studio in the '70s, because it's like, oh, I know this. I know, like for
Yeah.
instance, like the Valley People Dynamite. We
Hmm.
use those, or the DBX 160, or the 1176, or the LA 2A. These are all going back, many years, and and they're all still very popular in the emulation. But you're right. Even in the '70s, we didn't have 20 compressors,
Mhm.
per session like people have put. We'll put that in today. They'll put, we had a few compressors, which is why a lot of stuff was done as we recorded. It was recorded with the compressor. The
Right.
sound went in. That's why all your legendary engineers, guys from the '60s and even before, like Al Schmidt, all these great engineers, um, they get the sound going in.
Mhm.
They didn't like do like today. We say, "Oh, record it. We'll fix it in the mix," which is plus and minus. They had to. They can say how it's better or it's not. I don't think it's better. It's different. It's a different technique. Whatever works works. But at the same time, in those days, you didn't have the ability to add all these plugins, all this outboard gear. In most even professional studios, you had to utilize what you had. You had the tape, so you use tape compression. You hit the tape to get a certain thing. You had the board EQ. You use that, you know, as well as you could get as close to you could. And of course, there were no samples, so the sounds were very raw. You had to really fix a lot of drum sounds and get the sounds, as opposed to just having a sample that already sounds good. So it was very different, and but now it's a whole different world. And I love using a lot of plugins, um, but you have to step back a second and and kind of say, okay, are we going too far? I mean, just adding too many effects.
Mhm.
Sometimes you got to concentrate on the performance, and a lot of times people today don't concentrate on performance. Performance, say, oh, we can fix that with auto tune, or we could do this or that, and it's different, and I don't think it's as exciting as getting a great performance. That's still the key.
Yeah, I wish I had the experience and ears of Al Schmidt. But what's interesting is a lot of that comes also from the time. I look at my typical client who comes in with a budget and maybe 2 hours to record, two tracks or something. And in that time, I could get a great preamp sound maybe on the vocal with the correct compression going in, but the guitar player that's next to them and the keyboard player that's next to them has to almost be sacrificed due to the fact that the track has changed, and so it's almost like you have to make a few sacrifices, in my opinion, to say, okay, we're going to take the business, we're going to try and deliver the best product possible, but sometimes that doesn't really mean you've got the proper setup that you really would want as an engineer. And I found that's drastically changed just even in the past 20 years that I've been working in this industry. Just that mentality of this kind of fast pace, we need it now, it needs to be up on YouTube tonight, and that's the product.
Tell me about console one and my question is that is it only one question is does it only work with Softube plugins, and if so, which ones does it work with? And so talk about the console one, because I think that's the most exciting thing and most unique thing that Softube is doing.
Yeah, so actually behind me is console one and fader put together in a stand. I have one down here, which is this unit. It's console one. Fader is a separate unit. I'll just grab. So here's fader. They look pretty close to each other in terms of size. I mean, they're the same size. Console one came out about 7 years ago, and essentially it hasn't changed purpose-wise in 7 years. There's been additional functionality, some DAW integration, as you mentioned. It's fully integrated with Cubase, Nuendo, Live, uh, Cakewalk, uh, Reaper. I'm probably missing some others, um,
Is it
which
is it
means
created with Pro Tools too?
so it works really well with Pro Tools. It doesn't have full integration yet, which means that it gives you DAW level control. So I'll just show you. I could actually share my screen and show you a session and show you how it works. So let me just switch over
Yes, very good.
and get rid
And
of this. So I couldn't get. I know you're a Cubase user. I was having some weird glitches with getting the sample rate to match with Zoom as a driver, so I just switched to this. But essentially, it's the same idea, which is that you put the Console One plugin across every channel in your DAW. So we're in Studio One now, and once you do that, I can hit my display on the Console One, and I could select any of my tracks at the bottom. I can shape my tracks using a transient designer or a gate. I could EQ, I could compress, and I have the nonlinearities of the board that I select as a model to set my drive and character, which are the inherent distortion of all these analog consoles that we model. We have filters, we have the ability to invert polarity or switch the order of plugins. So to answer your question about what plugins are available, it comes with an SSL 4000E channel strip. That's originally the product it shipped with, which was, the idea was to model, give you tactile control of a great sound quality of an SSL board. Since then, we have a bunch of other channel strips available. So we have two that are specific to Console One fader, but we have the SSL 9K, British Class A, Summit Audio Grand Channel, which we were talking about before, American Class A. We have a Chandler board that we put together, a channel strip. It's not an actual console, but it's components. And then same thing with the Weiss. We have a mastering channel strip here, which could be used as just a mixed channel strip too. You could use Console One modularly, so you can be using something like the SSL 4K and be getting a great mix, but go, oh, you know, that EQ is not exactly working out the way I want it to. Let's switch for a different EQ. And you've got all your Softube EQs listed here, and additionally some Universal Audio UAD2 EQs. So if I wanted to come in and select something like the Weiss EQ1, I could select that and get that precision that Weiss is known for. So like a razor sharp Q to be able to come in and just surgically remove something if we needed to do that. So that's kind of where Console One has gone, is it's giving you this modular control, hands-on tactile control, so you can close your eyes and listen and make sure that if you're cutting a snare ring out, it's exactly where you want it. You're right on that peak that you need to remove, and you only remove exactly what you need, rather than look at a screen and say, okay, that looks good, which is the opposite way of how we should be EQing. We should be closing our eyes, and you know, if this was a bass track and my ears told me that this low cut was where my bass should be sitting, well then that's where it should be sitting. Of course, that's an absurd example I just came up with just to kind of give you an exaggeration, but you get the point. The idea of closing our eyes, getting our hands on a knob like we used to do in the old days before our hands were on a mouse, and using our ears rather than our eyes to make choices. That's what Console One's about. But to answer your question, there's still nothing stopping you from saying, okay, here's that Console One plugin that gives me the control, and I want to insert the plugin of another company underneath. There's nothing stopping you from doing that. So if there's a plugin you love that you've used over the years, you could certainly put it in there. Nothing changes. The Console One's $549, and currently Console One fader is on sale for $649. So for about whatever that is, $1,100, $1,200, you basically get a complete analog workflow at your fingertips. I mean, it's obviously in the box, but it's an analog feel of a workflow of the way a real analog board would feel, with your hands on faders, your hands on knobs, being able to close your eyes and feel a whole channel strip. But the real big deal for me is actually the idea that if you look at the space behind me, that I don't have a gigantic space. I mean, it's fairly sizable in here. You know, it's a nice sized room. It's not a gigantic recording studio or anything, but for tracking small bands in the other room, I could then come on here and just right in front of me, without having a giant board, without having to worry about maintenance of a board or air conditioning costs to keep the board or the room nice and cool. It's all just right there in front of me, and it's, you know, I'm always in my listening position, which is a big deal to me. I know what my speakers sound like when I'm right in front of them, but if I'm at an analog console going side to side, things do change your perspective, you know, as your perspective changes. So for me, having everything just like right centered in front of me, having that tactile control is really a big change. And For students, where I teach at my college, we have 22 or 24 console ones at a workstation. We teach a Pro Tools curriculum. We do have Cubase and we have Ableton Live and some other DAWs running too. But the big thing is the students can turn off that on-screen display that I was just showing you, put their hand on the high mid gain, boost it, adjust the bandwidth, and sweep around to find something that's maybe a ring that they want to remove, or sweep around to find something that opens up the vocals so that there's a little bit more intelligibility or just openness to the voice without bringing out sibilance. And they do that without looking at the screen because we actually turn the screens off. And that's what develops their ears, just like we used to do in the old days. We close our eyes or we just listen rather than say, okay, let's boost the vocal between 4 to 7 because that'll add some openness or top end without really thinking about, oh, well, we just added some sibilance there too. And, that was kind of counterproductive.
Right, exactly. Using your ears is still the most important way to do it. And that's a really good training method that you're using, depending on the screen. Yeah, it's great. That's great. It's excellent.
And
And I'm sure, and also, I mean, it seems to be a very good solution for people who, um, a little older than the students who have been trained and worked with faders, with boards, and want to go into the box more. And this is kind of like a entry into that without forgetting, the tactile way, the workflow. So
yeah.
It's a great idea. It's an excellent idea. Um, yeah, it's really cool. I wish I had room for one here.
Yeah. They're small. We'll get you one. But getting back to the older guys, I'm in my 40s, but I think initially we thought that this product would be a product for that younger generation that wanted to be able to feel what it felt like to be mixing in the old days. What I've found is, yeah, we do have that. We have a lot of people using Ableton Live and doing some EDM type stuff with really cool filter sweeps that they automate. But what I've also found is the opposite, is that I have a lot of people who are in their late 60s and 70s who are great engineers that have been afraid of DAWs because they worked on tape, they worked on an analog console, and they only really have basic DAW knowledge. And really what this allows them to do is hit record, just capture it like it was tape, and then go back in and work like it's an analog console. And we get letters and comments from people all the time about how this really brought them back to the old days of mixing in the 60s or mixing in the 70s. And when Softube worked with Marshall, and I know we're getting away from boards, but this is an example of how we pick things. When we worked with Marshall to pick the something like the Blues Breaker amp, we went to Marshall and we said, what is the kind of quintessential best version of this amp? And they actually went into the Marshall Vault or the Marshall Museum or whatever it's called, where they had kind of like their pride possession of what they felt was the best version of that amplifier. And that's the one we use to model. So Softube does do their due diligence in making sure that the unit that they're looking at is a unit that the manufacturer felt is kind of like the gold standard of their units. And one thing, just to address what you were talking about, one thing that is interesting is we feature the drive and the character of each board. And I'm bringing this up to address what you just said. So when you actually load a console, it loads with the drive off, which means it's not actually modeling that console's nonlinearities or drive sound or components inside. It's just giving you the EQ curve and the compressor. But as you bring the drive up to 5, it actually models the board authentically, or you could exaggerate that drive. And what the character does is it gives you variations in how the drive sounds, maybe from channel 1 to channel 2 on the analog board. It depends on the board you're using. Some boards will give you second-order harmonic versus third-order harmonic. Some will drive the EQ harder or the compressor harder. And what's interesting about that character is it allows you to have those tonal differences in the drive that some of those changes from year to year on certain analog boards had, which is something you were alluding to. In terms of efficiency, I've run on my MacBook Pro. I've mixed a 50-track session with Console 1 on every single channel. No external DSP like the Universal Audio satellites or anything like that. And and my computer's been fine handling it. So it's super efficient. Obviously, the more processing you do on each channel, so if I turn the EQ, shape, compressor, and drive on every single channel, it will add a little bit more tax on the host computer, but it is super efficient. And yeah, and if you're not doing any processing, like if the EQ's off, if the drive's off, all it's actually doing is controlling the volume and pan and solo and mute of your DAW. It's not actually adding any sound quality to it. It's just giving you DAW control. Yeah, so it's 10 faders. I'll just lift this up. Console 1 went 1 to 20. There were 20 knobs or 20 buttons at the top that you could select your track from. When we added Console 1 fader, it gives you 10 faders. It's full throw 100 millimeter Alps faders. They're motorized. They're touch sensitive, which means if you want to write automation by lightly touching them, you could do touch automation really easily. The nice thing about 10 faders, we come from 8 faders because of analog buckets, and I know you know this, but if we're showing this to students, they may not. That's why we see a lot of controllers with 8, is because it comes from the old days of analog. Softube didn't start in the analog world. Softube started in the digital world. And so 10 is a number that seems to make more sense to young engineers who grew up learning math in tens, which is a different way of learning math than you and I learn math. That's in terms of the way they're taught. They've learned with iPads. They've grown up with iPads and computers. So thinking in tens and banking in tens becomes super fast to them, and it just makes the workflow easier. So Console 1 has 20 buttons at the top. You could select 1 to 20. So if you have Console 1 and fader, like I do behind me, Console 1 has 1 to 20, and fader has 1 to 10. So when you go to, let's say, track 11 on the top unit, it banks fader 1 to be number 11. You can do more.
Right. That's why 10 makes more sense.
Yeah, and you can do more than 1 fader unit. So if you wanted 2 fader units underneath so that you had 20 faders, you could do that too.
Okay, that's good.
But yeah, it makes, if you're in a, probably the largest session I mixed was, I don't know, maybe 150 tracks. And, when you get over that 50 point, it's, having the ability to bank really quickly in tens is way easier than thinking in eights. If you hit 8, 7 times, it depends how good your math is.
How does it hook up to the computer? USB?
Yeah, so Console 1 is bus powered via USB. Fader connects via USB, but it has a required power supply because they are motorized faders. But yeah, it's super simple. I just use a USB hub and plug it in, and it's good to go. What's interesting about Parallels is it's sample-based and wavetable-based. So yeah, here's Parallels. I'll just give you a quick rundown. So the cool thing about it is you have these 2 sound generators and something to mix them. And you can load a wavetable into each of these, and you could select the point at which each wavetable starts. You have your ADSR that you would typically have, and you have a color movement, which is unique, which is how it moves through that wavetable, whether it goes back and forth and how quickly. On the right-hand side, you have the ability to set different filters. You could select a resonant filter and adjust the shape of each one. And on the far right side is the last place, which is the effects channel that it goes through. On the left-hand side is your modulation section, which is 4 different modulation types that you could select from. And the goal here with Parallels was to give you amazing sound quality of analog synths and some new electronic synths and digital synths. And you could scroll through them really easily and just load them in. The goal was to give you something that gives you that amazing sound quality, but without going crazy with learning programming. And, I remember trying to program a DX7 for the first time, and I'd still probably...
I was just going to talk about that. My experience. The DX7, you never knew what you were going to get.
No, hell no. I mean,
interaction of the algorithms.
Yeah.
Was like, there was no way you could actually tell, if I put this here, what's going to do it, and then you'll find out when you do it. But,
right. Yeah.
That was a pain in the butt to try to program.
Yeah. So from a historical perspective or understanding programming perspective, the DX7 was amazing. But That's not what this product is about. This product is about being able to load a sound that is maybe from the 70s or 80s or even something modern, and or even earlier even, and being able to just have it there, manipulate it with some creative ways, and not have to worry about learning intense amounts of programming. It's just very visual. It looks good. It feels good. It's logical how it flows left to right. Uh, and it sounds great too. And we have some great sound examples on the website. I don't have my keyboard hooked up, otherwise I'd play. But yeah, and just very quickly, are you able to see modular? I just loaded it up here for you.
Oh, I see all kinds of things here.
Yeah, so just because you were just talking about it, I'll just quickly show you. So it's interesting. Modular loads actually completely blank, and you have to go in and actually select all of your modules that you want to add, and then once you do, you have to actually come in and connect each one of these modules using these virtual patch cables, and even route to your main audio output. But getting back to what you said about Buchla, yeah, we have two Buchla units. We have the 259 and um, and then we have the 296E, which this is the one you were talking about, the spectral processor, which can do vocoding and works as a filter. But it's super deep, and this kind of gets back into what you were talking about with the ARP stuff, needing to connect everything, patch everything, and so from an educational point, just being able to, know that you have to take each one of these cables and connect them to a specific place to be able to get certain things happening and certain sound working is
It's
awesome.
like learning circuit flow.
It is, yeah, with less risk of electrocution when you're dealing with a vintage unit. But
I'm gonna check it out. I'll check it
yeah,
out. Okay, cool. But anyway, well, thank you so much, Todd, for being our guest.
yeah, thank you, Rick. Appreciate you having me.